So welcome to our first edition of Wisdom and Exile Radio. My name is Paul Haddon, and I'm joined by my good friends Adrian and Norin, and we're all members of the Sakya Buddhist Center in Los Angeles. And this is going to be a first of a series of podcasts talking about a book by our teacher Lama Jampatai, which is called Wisdom in Exile, Buddhism in Modern Times. And if I just give a summary of the book for those who haven't read it as yet, you can sort of break it down into two parts. The first is really about how there appears now to be an opportunity or a space for Buddhism in the West. Partly it's sort of an account of the decline of spirituality and religion in the West and how that sort of creates a space for Buddhism, potentially. And then the second half of the book is then they're more about some of the obstacles or challenges that Buddhism faces in becoming established in the West. And that sort of mirrors the first half, but because in a sense it's the rise of science or scientism and grasping after political ideologies in a way, some sort of salvation, creates obstacles for Buddhism to become established. So with that, maybe I'll pass over to Norin. Do you want to sort of give us an overview of some of the key points you took away from the forewords and the preface in the book?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So there's three forewords by three of Lama Jampa's teachers. There's His Holiness Sakya Trizin, who's head of the Sakya tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. There's His Holiness the Karmapa, who's head of the Kagyu tradition. And then there's Karma Tinli Rinpoche, who is a master of both traditions and Lama Jampa's root teacher. Sakya Trizin's forward, he talks about re-examining our motivation for Buddhism and emphasizes the importance of Buddhism remaining true to its source and how to avoid wrong views. His Holiness Karmapa talks about the importance of avoiding misguided beliefs that the tenets of our own cultural and spiritual traditions are not the actual teachings of Buddhism. And then Karma Tinli's forward is very succinct. It's important to distinguish that there are some paths to be adopted and that there are some that need to be rejected. And it is very important to discriminate between these two, between what is authentic and what is inauthentic. So all three forewords have this common theme. And more importantly, you have the approval of those two major traditions of Tibetan Buddhism and stamp of approval on Lama Jampa's book.
Yeah, I took away some of the same main points as well. And I think that your last point is really key, isn't it? I mean, it's pretty remarkable. You've got the heads of two of the four main traditions of Buddhism that came through Tibet, writing a forward and so respectful forwards for Lama Jampa, who's a Western Buddhist master, one of the sort of first Western masters of the Tibetan tradition. And then your earlier point as well about Westerners, approaching Buddhism, isn't it? And how easy it is to take what we, our sort of cultural values and so, which is so deep-rooted as maybe the same as Buddhism and sort of equating the two.
Lama Jampa did talk about his book. He talked about the self-esteem movement and how Buddhism is been confused as it's come over from the West. I did start to read a little bit about that self-esteem movement. I didn't realize it was like a whole legal thing. It started in California. There was some psychiatrist back in the 60s who wrote some big essay about how the key to success in life is having a good self-esteem. And then they mandated all these laws in California, things like they really came down hard on those sports in schools where there's a winner and a loser, and they try to flatten that whole playing field out and make everybody a winner. And I don't know if you remember that, but it really came through the education system in the 90s, and it was like everyone's a winner now, and you're going to get an award just for turning up.
It's still prevalent, isn't it? Like my children, they go to a tournament, everyone gets a gold medal. Or, they're part of the chess team, everyone that played chess gets a massive trophy. It's like...
But then they did a follow-up study to see if these interventions had any impact at all, and they didn't. But but it was really picked up on by the media and propagated as this movement that had to be adopted culturally. And it was, like you said, it's still going on now. And I think that to harken back to the foreword is one of the big risks and pitfalls that many people who first encounter Buddhism come into. Because I've had many conversations with people and they say, "Oh, are you a Buddhist?" "Oh, yeah, I've dabbled in that. I've done some meditation." But I try and get out of those conversations as quickly as possible, because it turns out where they're talking about some workshop they've attended, which is not Buddhist at all, but it's like there was some degree of mindfulness meditation or something that has been kind of adulterated from Buddhism into this feel-good, self-esteem, preface to whatever workplace thing they're talking about.
It's definitely a book about the encounter of Buddhism and modernity. I mean, you could say the West, but actually now Western culture, American culture, and modern things have gone worldwide, and lots of traditional societies outside of the West have modernized and have a lot of the cultural aspects that the book talks about. I should also say that two of us, me and Paul Haddon, are in California. We live here, although we're all from England originally. And Norin, whose real name is also Paul, but we call him Norin to differentiate the two Pauls, is in Oregon, which is, and California and Oregon, I think it's fair to say, are a source of many of the ideas of modernity, especially late 20th century, early 21st century modernity, and San Francisco, being the origin of a lot of these sort of so-called countercultural movements that came out in the late 60s, which we're probably going to get into, if not this week, then soon.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Before we maybe move on to the preface, Jump's preface, just something you were talking about then, Paul, as well, about, it's quite common, isn't it? In my classes as well, often have a chat with people that come along and see if they got some background in Buddhism or meditation, and nowadays most of them have. And to your point, I think one of the things about this book, when you step back from it, is like you said, Ada, it's like, the Buddhism meets modern society, and particularly the influence of Western society on people's beliefs and so on. And then people come to Buddhism, which is very different from what we normally, normal values and understanding of what's going on certainly in Western cultures. And, if you look back in history, isn't it, like Tibet itself, because we're trained more in the Tibetan tradition, it took hundreds of years for Buddhism to get established in Tibet. And when you look at Tibetan history, there's so many incidents and great masters who had to come in and correct people's understanding of what Buddhism was, because people had deviated so far from what it was really about and what the real meaning was. And so there's quite a few so-called sort of corrections of what Buddhism is and isn't that you see in Tibetan history. And I think in some ways Lama Jhampa's book is a little bit like that, like an early indicator of, what's authentic, what isn't authentic, how do you tell the difference and discriminate between them.
Yeah, it's but it's specific to the modern or modernity. So the problems of transmitting Buddhism from India to Tibet were, to some extent, cultural Tibetan accretions into Buddhism, especially like Tibetan folk religion. They definitely like their sort of spirit worship and mountain and lake spirits, and they had their folk religions, and they loved to corrupt Buddhism by turning it into this sort of animistic spirit, forms of animistic spirit worship, which Buddhism isn't, and at its core. But of course, the Westerners, to the other extreme, they're very, very materialistic and overly credulous belief in science, which we'll get into as well, scientism. And materialism, there's nothing other than material substance in the universe. In our modern world, that's our sort of thing. And also certain, which we'll get into, certain mental patterns and habits that are somewhat peculiar to modernity. And what happens when Buddhism meets them, they try and take over Buddhism and make it about Buddhism. And one of those things is turning it into a therapy, which has already been touched on. Yeah. Of course, it happened immediately. As soon as Buddhism came to the West, it's like, oh, it must be a therapy, because we know what that is. We like therapy, and we like increasing ourself. So yeah, the book is a counter to that, with a specific focus on those Western preconceptions, misconceptions, and tendencies to turn it into something that it already knows and is familiar with.
Yeah, this is really important points, because Lama mentions the importance of Buddhism not becoming this watered down version of some kind of psychotherapy. And part of it is that we're a very progressive culture. We like to take something and make it better. And he really emphasized the importance of having the role of being an apprentice and really just mastering Buddhism from these great masters. And the challenge being that Tibetan Buddhism has become a religion in exile. It's given this power to the audience that they wouldn't normally have. And that, along with our progressive inclinations, has kind of created this perfect storm for people to take offshoots of Buddhism and turn it into all these things that are not authentic and true to its source.
We covered the sort of the forwards and the intro. Shall we move into chapter 1?
Yeah, chapter 1 it is called Meetings, and it's a very short chapter by way of introducing the themes of the book, and it's sort of anecdotal about Lama Jampa's experience beginning in the mid to late 60s, as Buddhism was starting to enter at the time where he was living in England, and of course, he was entering the West generally, and teachers were coming over for the first time, really, to the West, and there was some existing. There'd been some Buddhism come in previously, and there was a Buddhist society led by this famous judge, Christmas Humphreys. But this new sort of modern era was really starting to become mainstream. This kind of 1960s culture. So as a young man, Lama Jampa had all these sort of cultural background, but was encountering Buddhism for the first time. And it talks a little bit about both what it was like, the kind of people who were around in the late 60s, the kind of people who were interested in Buddhism were very much coming out of this hippie movement, and also the beats. We're all it's a bit before our time. We were more kind of 90s kids. We had similar sort of cultural influences at the time, but Buddhism was certainly new then.
The beginning. So it's like a personal summary, isn't it, of how Lama Jampa himself got interested in Buddhism and found his way into Buddhism. How do you encounter it? How do you engage with it? And some of the confusion around what it's about. So sort of Buddhism meets the West, isn't it? For, like you're saying, in a big way, for sort of first time.
Yeah, one of the things he talks about is really freeing himself over a few years from those cultural accretions that he initially took with him into Buddhism, and an assumption that that Buddhism had some kind of affinity with the counterculture or the beat poets or something. There was some kind of connection there, and whilst those people to some extent made some openings for Buddhism to be able to come in, at the end of the day, those movements were not at their core Buddhist. They had different values and beliefs at the end of the day, and whilst there was a sort of happy parallel for a certain amount of time that enabled people to enter from that world to enter Buddhism to an extent, there had to also be a separation, especially as the countercultural movement became embroiled in drugs and ultimately politics. And Lama Jampa basically had to, at a certain point, say, well, I want to follow the Buddhist path. There's a divergence happening now. The Western culture is going one way, but Buddhism is showing actually a different way. So I'm going to follow that path. But of course, a lot of people were much more comfortable with the Western modern countercultural path, stuck with it, might have even continued to call themselves Buddhist, but there were some quite fundamental differences there about stuff we've been talking about, like self-help, materialism, politics.
Right, it did seem like, so back then he talks about the beats, and he talks about Kerouac, because he was introduced to Kerouac by one of his teachers, because the teacher said, like, if you like Bob Dylan, you'll probably like Jack Kerouac. And he talks about Kerouac introducing him to the luminous emptiness, that it's the heart of all things. And so I think a lot of people got a similar thing from reading beat literature, but then you have to extract that from everything else that's in beat literature. Like, you know, there's, like you said, the counterculture movement and the drug culture, which isn't part of Buddhism at all. So there is this process of extracting things that you're exposed to when you first come across Buddhism, and finding out what is authentic and what is not.
Yeah.
I guess, yeah, like I say, he mentions like Dylan and Kerouac in particular, isn't it? And to your point, I guess both of them have like an element of some sort of insight into the transcendent, something, you know, beyond the mundane about them. And then Kerouac, I mean, I've only read a couple of his books, On the Road and Dharma Bums. But you can sort of, in a way, Dharma Bums in particular is like the quintessential book in a way of Buddhism meets the West, and in some ways, and sort of opening his mind to this other, you know, vaster reality in a way, which I guess, you know, Lama mentioned resonated. But at the same time, in Dharma Bums, exactly like you say, Paul, you can sort of see the descent into sort of confusion and interpretation of what it was all about, and then mixing it up, like say, bad habits, which, you know, which are very different from the sort of the ethics and the lifestyle, you know, which is really taught in Buddhism. But at the same time, I guess it's like an indicator of that space, isn't it? That sort of openness in a way, and how sometimes it can still resonate with people, and you get that connection, but then how that can then lead them down to a wrong path, if you, like you say, like Adrian say, if you don't let go of some of these cultural assumptions and values, and if you don't go all in, you take the bits you like and carry on with the other stuff you already liked, you know, that's sort of the path to nowhere.
It's interesting because I think there's a common theme in first encountering Buddhism, whether it was in the 60s or whether it's when we first encountered it, or even today, where there's a process of extracting. I think it's really interesting that how we all first came into Buddhism, to be honest.
But I think we were doing the same course, wasn't it?
Yeah, we were doing philosophy, Western philosophy, of course, which I think, you know, I think we were probably both. Well, I can't speak for you, but I was looking for some kind of answers, because, you know, I definitely sensed, even at the tender age of 18 or whatever, that Western, you know, worldview of, you know, just science and the inevitable continuing decline of Christianity was unsatisfactory and insufficient. And I really was looking, I think, in philosophy for some kind of answers, and I really felt I didn't find them. By the third year of philosophy course, Manchester, I just thought the only thing here is refutations of ideas that people put forth. There doesn't seem to be really anything that anyone can agree on here, and that's the characteristic of modernity now. I think in general, it's just this constant movement from one thing onto the next thing, dissatisfaction onto the next thing, whether it's intellectual space, you know, musical space, cultural space, anything at all. It's just this constant obsession with novelty. And again, you know, that Buddhism is not part of that. You know, we have a completely different take and view of novelty. That, you know, the Buddha was had complete enlightenment, and his teaching was, you know, completely perfect expression of that enlightenment. And you don't need to have novelty. In fact, the preciousness of it is in preserving it, and the challenge is in preserving it. So
yeah, it's funny, I came to a completely opposite end of the spectrum. So I guess your background in some ways has been more like Lama Jampa, like, you know, he had a Catholic upbringing.
Yeah, I was Catholic, yeah.
Family, whereas I was sort of brought up as, you know, atheist, very political, completely avid activist, Marxist. And I went to university to study philosophy so I could better understand Marx, which meant I had to understand Hegel. So that's why I was there.
Yeah, right.
And so I was full on that. But I also had this sense, similar to you, I really wanted to know the truth, you know, and I thought Marxism was truth. It really was a bit, in retrospect, like my religion, really. And so I thought I would find confirmation of it is all matter, and the materialist dialectic is like clearly the right view. And then by the time I got to Hegel, it was like, you know, shit, you know, Marx wasn't that bright, was he? But there are a lot of better Western philosophers, a lot more sophisticated, a lot more correct. And like the materialist thing was just some complete leap of faith, which based on no reason. And so it was a complete eye-opener to me. And just as I was sort of coming to that view, that's when I met some friends studying under Lama Jampa, and then for the first time heard about Buddhist philosophy. And when I heard that explanation, it was like, you know, right, that's it.
Yeah.
It was, you know, he opens up with this, you know, him going to the Buddhist Centre, the Buddhist Society in central London. I've been there a few times with my wife, you know, Roz, and when we used to live in London, and it's like Lama described, it's very, very, yeah, old, I don't know, Georgian, really big building, and so lots of mahogany inside and very traditional. And so Lama Jampa's describing he's with the person who founded and so ran the Buddhist Society, was a High Court judge, and you know, so obviously thought he knew a lot about Buddhism, and he dropped into conversations, you know, he knew the Dalai Lama and gave him lots of good advice, and they were there to meet head of the Sakya tradition. His Holiness Sakya-trism is like, he's in, you know, in the Tibetan hierarchy, second to the Dalai Lama. And then just before he arrived, he was asking, again, yeah, who is he again? What's his name? And then like in the introduction inside, he's giving a talk about how this judge,
Christmas Humphreys, yeah,
is explaining how he's the first person in history to realize and explain the 12 essential points of Buddhism, so we can now understand it more clearly. And the thing that really struck me about that, Lama's very diplomatic about it. He doesn't really draw conclusions, but what you can see is one of the problems in the West is this arrogance. You know, you've got a tradition, 2,500 year tradition, that's been just coming to the West for the first few years. Most of the detailed scholarly works haven't been translated, let alone studied and understood by anyone. But, you know, people are immediately proclaiming, we know it better than they did.
Yeah, I was going to say that is definitely one of the characteristics of the Western mind encountering Buddhism, is its arrogance. It knows everything about it already. And what's funny about that in this chapter 1 is that Christmas Humphreys, this High Court judge, was definitely from the pre-war British culture, which was obviously completely different to what came later with the late 60s and the hippie movement. But they actually had in common, they both had in common this arrogance that I already understand Buddhism, they're just coming from a completely different place. The pre-war people, and not just, of course, establishment people like judges, but these kind of precursors to the counterculture, to the hippie movement, like Aleister Crowley, we were going to mention, or some of these people like Robert Graves and the Bloomsbury set, or you know, some of the any of the kind of academics who studied Buddhism in the West, or Westerners who studied it abroad in the East before the Second World War. A lot of them there was definitely very little understanding came out of that, and partly mainly because there wasn't really a personal connection with teachers. People didn't follow teachers, but at most they read books. There was no true teacher-student relationship until at least the late 60s, and probably later than that. And even now it's pretty rare, I think, for Westerners to actually do that. It's probably one of the biggest obstacles they have. But yeah, you know, even though the post-war, the late 60s and the more, you know, modern or postmodern generations, like the baby boomer generation and the generations after, didn't have that old establishment kind of arrogance, like we already know it, you know, we're masters of the world. They still had a massive amount of arrogance to say we already know Buddhism, and it's basically, you know, what we think already, and it's just a question of hanging out, burning some incense, and doing things we already do. Buddhism doesn't create any challenge to myself, my preconceptions, and my worldview. I'll just carry on as I am and call myself a Buddhist.
It speaks a lot to the Western perception of a teacher and the teacher-student relationship, or the apprentice and master relationship, because in the West we have a concept that we're equals, but one of us has some wisdom to impart to the other. One of us has some information and some knowledge. It's not like you're meeting your therapist and you're getting some information on how to improve yourself and overcome your emotional obstacles, where in that relationship you're basically a meeting of equals, where one is just kind of beneficently trying to help the other. It's a very different relationship, which is quite complex, but it's definitely not a meeting of equals. Like when Christmas Humphreys met His Holiness Sakya-Trizin, I think he probably felt like it was. Whereas I think Lama Jampa had a very different approach. Here is somebody, a realized master who I can learn from. And so to take the lowest view, the humble approach.
Well, it's really like the book itself, isn't it? I've got the first page dedicated to my lamas.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's really it, isn't it? And then Lama Jampa then asks his lamas to write a preface in a way sort of for their blessings of what he's doing. But everything is sort of, like say, traditional Buddhism, everything is, all blessings flow from the lineage of the teachings, because they like go back to the enlightened source of the Buddha himself. And so that, whereas, the vibe you get from this, the Buddhist society is not like that.
Yeah, I mean, many of the so-called Buddhist centers in the West are really just manifestations of the Western mind and the Western ego. They more, and the people, it more reflects this. Like I say, like there's when Buddhism and modernity meet, there's something of a war where certainly in each individual, where either the Western modernity wins and Buddhism is just shriveled into an ineffective kind of husk, or Buddhism actually is embraced, and then the modern ideas and the modern tendencies and habits, they're the ones that have to exit stage left. So you can't really have both together. And I think most of what is called Buddhism and what is regarded as Buddhism in the West is actually more Western than Buddhism.
Right. So there's a lot of literature talking about how Buddhism has been made more acceptable for Western audiences. And there's actually quite a lot about Zen, how Zen has been kind of made into this modern Buddhism or neo-Buddhism. I've heard the term bandied around. But and then Tibetan Buddhism has been criticized. So on the one hand, it's embraced because it's a form of spirituality and it's a religion that is non-theistic. So that is technically in line with the modern world, because we've rejected Christianity, we've rejected theism, and we've embraced science and reason. But we still want some kind of spiritual element. But then they criticize Tibetan Buddhism because it's still very traditional and it has all these stuffy rituals, and we need to bring it up to speed and make it more modern and more relevant for the society and the culture that we're living in.
It's narcissism, so it needs to look more like me. But Buddhism's fine, but it's not like me enough. So it needs to be more like me. It's this strange Western.
You can see how it's people justify though that approach in as much.
Yeah. I think we'll get into this, but there's also a very interesting parallel, which we'll get into in chapter 2, between Protestantism and the modern Western attitude towards religion and politics and science. But that a lot of Westerners do seem drawn to Zen as opposed to Tibetan Buddhism. I think partly because they look at it and they see something that seems a bit more like Western Protestantism. There's a bit of austerity there, a bit of iconoclasm, and a kind of moralizing purity there, or at least so they see. Whereas when they look at Tibetan Buddhism, they see something a bit more like Catholicism, with incense and bells and shrines, and what looks a bit like magic. Of course, it is, and we understand these things mainly as symbols, but that Protestant ethic of out with the superstition, in with the pure iconoclasm, and moralizing purity that attracts them to Zen, and corrupts their encounter with Tibetan Buddhism, even to the extent that they do engage with it.
Yeah. It's interesting because then, when you do have these conversations with people and they ask about your faith and you say that you're a Buddhist, and they say, oh, I am too. And then you have these embarrassing conversations with them where, in fact, they're either following some, modernized hybrid of that's taken elements of Buddhism, or, worst case scenario, they've done some weird workshop, which is like a reversal of Tonglen, where they're doing the sending, and instead of doing the sending and taking with the, in Tonglen, where you're sending out happiness and you're absorbing all the negativity. So you're sending out, right? They're doing the reversal of this, which harkens back to the whole self-esteem thing, where you're breathing in all the positivity in the world and the goal.
Taking everyone's happiness and giving them your
suffering. Essentially, just like, here's all my negativity. You can have that external world, and and then you're feeling great. You're full of yourself is fully esteemed.
Yeah.
But it's awful. It's the polar opposite of Buddhism.
Yeah, that seems like in the book, isn't it? I think Lama says, like, in the 60s search for truth and meaning, some seem to hear free from self, and others heard free the self. Yeah. And I think that's exactly what you're highlighting, isn't it? It's like complete opposite of what Buddhism's about, and yet the two confused and confounded.
And you still get, and especially here in California, you still get these remnants of the late 1960s, hippie encounter with Buddhism. I met a guy, actually this on the East Coast, who wanted me to, who was of that generation, and he wanted me to refer to him by his name of Fireball, because it is so absurd. But this was a couple of years ago, so it was literally 50 years after 1968. 50 years, that there's people who've been kind of living these late 60s values. Somehow I've been able to do it for 50 years. Now they're in their 70s, and still haven't been able to let go of them. I mean, we're all guilty of it to a certain extent. I'm sure, whatever era you grew up in, you imbibe certain values. And most of us will come to Buddhism a bit late in life, not as children, but as adults. So we've already taken in a whole load of stuff, internalized a whole load of stuff of modernity and progress and materialism. So, don't mean to single anyone out, but 50 years is a long time to be carrying around some of these ideas, especially when
name like Fireball.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that has always been stressed, if you follow a teacher, our teacher is thinking about impermanence and death. It absolutely brings a seriousness to everything that follows. Whatever reason you come to Buddhism, it's probably not that primarily. Like everyone has their own reasons, some kind of attraction, some kind of connection to it. Some often, very genuine feeling that there's something really important here that I can do. But whatever it is, whatever reason you end up, in a Buddhist center or with a Buddhist teacher studying. It has to be channeled through reflection on impermanence and death, which strips away all of the nonsense, and if you don't do that, then it just becomes another facet of modernity.
Right, it's a good point, because like we didn't all get into Buddhism and it wasn't just an easy ride where we were like, oh, this was my intent from day one. This was my motivation, and I wasn't challenged at all. There are some very hard stops that you come up against.
I mean, we all knew each other in our late teens, early 20s, and I remember what Paul looked like, and what I look like. I mean, we've changed quite a bit, or had to, and just mainly cutting away nonsense. I don't know if I can say. I remember meeting you, Norin, at the Glastonbury Festival in 1993. I think it was, and you weren't practicing virtue at the time. I'll say that. But yeah, we've all had to.
I don't think you were either, though. In fairness,
I actually wasn't. No, that's why I met you. Yeah, but yeah, we've had to drop like a lot of that.
Yeah, we did
stuff that we were doing. It was a very hedonistic time, and Buddhism part of that. But if we didn't take it seriously, we'd still be carrying on with the kind of hijinks, rosy-cheeked hijinks that we were doing in our early 20s.
Yeah, I remember first seeing like you doing shamatha meditation at your brother's flat in London.
Oh yeah,
and I was quite intrigued because you always managed to keep it together, And I was like, "What's his secret? What's going on? He's got some secret?"
You were living in a squat in Shepherd's Bush, if I recall.
Yeah, but you always held
it and some other rather
unsavory characters. Yeah, but so I was intrigued, like just what your secret was, and then you were like, "Oh, I'm just doing meditation." And then I went up to Manchester to visit you both, and Paul was up there too, and you were both like back then, like everyone was pretty hedonistic. So I like the thing that stood out was that at that time, when people were able to see through hedonism to something else, it was quite impressive. It was almost like rebellious in a way, a kind of ironic way.
We also deluded ourselves a lot. I think that the hedonism had a spiritual aspect by telling ourselves that we were, taking all of this, psychedelic drugs to find the truth or something. And you can kind of delude yourself for quite a long time that's what you're doing. But at the end of the day, you've got to admit at some point, like, this isn't going anywhere.
I think it's a doorway to a lot of people. A meeting.
Yeah, at best. But not to Buddhism.
Well, it can be. Buddhism.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Anyone, so you could take that door.
Yeah.
But like you say, when you, if you start practicing, isn't it? You do actually take it seriously. So you let go of all these bad habits and so on. It's remarkable how you're so busy chasing happiness. You strip that away, like say, Paul, in a way, not because you're seeking happiness over here per se, but because you've got this bigger ambition in a way around leading some sort of spiritual life and reorientating your goals, taking death seriously. But it's remarkable how even a relatively short period of time, but over the years, you feel a lot lighter. People are just chasing the wrong stuff, thinking it's going to make them happy, and only finding discontent, disillusionment, and Buddhism can actually offer them something real. I remember once that movie Independence Day.
Yeah, I like that movie.
Yeah, me too. And there's this bit in that which I thought was really interesting. Do you remember when the aliens were above that skyscraper? And they're looking the aliens, they're looking out there like this. There was the old thing, wasn't it? Yeah, you're gonna save you. You're obviously great, and you're our saviors. Struck me like, everyone's looking for their savior, even God or now this or whatever. But it's like, Buddhism's been here 2,500 years, and actually Lord Buddha showed the path. The thing is, it's not faith-based. It's not like, oh, I'm a Buddhist, now I'm saved. You actually then got to walk the path and do all the effort and training. But the path and the way is already there. This, a real path to liberation, but no one is looking for. No one wants to take it. No one sees it. They're just looking completely the wrong places.
Well, that's partly because we've been raised to look externally to ourselves, especially because you talked about, like, really went to college and you were raised a Marxist and you believed in it. And Marxism is very much about projecting, looking for answers externally. And it doesn't really surprise me that you were really angry back then, because, like, as a Marxist, I mean, that state of mind is baseline. You're angry at the wealthy, powerful people who are, stopping everybody else being happy. And I think the hard thing about Buddhism is that the enemy isn't external to yourself. You have to really turn blame onto yourself and say, like, I'm the one at fault. If there is problems that need fixing, then I'm going to have to do some internal work to address that, not try and go on a political march or do all of these things that are external that may have some benefit, may not, but it's certainly not going to be a spiritual benefit. And I think that's the hard thing for a lot of people is no one wants to be told that actually you're at fault. Some of your wrong ways of thinking are the source of your suffering. That's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow right off the bat. But then to be told, you have to follow, you can't just figure this out by yourself. You have to follow a teacher. And you then have to do some really hard work about making those changes. Is people are like, we're in a high-speed society culture where we want a result. As soon as we pay our money, get our fast food, and leave. We don't want to have to, like, hang around and cook the meal or gather the ingredients. We're not used to doing that kind of work, and so it is quite a hard and a challenging path, which I think is where the danger lies in trying to make it more compatible for modern society. We don't want to make it easier and more palatable to people. It's hard and unpalatable for a reason, So,
selling it.
Yeah, well.
So maybe we should wrap up there. We're going for a while and covered a lot of ground. So in particular, we've covered the forwards, Lama Jampa's introduction to his book and chapter 1, really about his own account of how Buddhism and the West sort of collided with his own encounter with Buddhism and how he entered the Buddhist path himself, and touched on a lot of topics. So next week, we'll move into chapter 2, the space for Buddhism. And there's a lot of really interesting material there. I'm sure we'll cover, particularly the Enlightenment period and other aspects. So maybe wrap up there and talk again next week.
That's good. All right.
Thanks a lot.